The massive shakeup on the Jets coaching staff proves that the team should have fired Aaron Glenn. Locked On Jets starts now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, John B. from GangrenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day, and for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. A big shout out to you everydayers. If you're new to the show, this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. On today's show, we are talking about massive shakeups to the New York Jets coaching staff. The team has begun its second round of interviews for its open defensive coordinator job, and a favorite might be starting to emerge. That favorite, though, is the wrong fit. We'll talk about a big change that could be coming to the Jets offensive coaching staff. Tanner Engstrand is facing a demotion, according to multiple reports. It's the right move. But we'll begin by talking about some major changes that have been announced by the team. Aaron Glenn has fired 6 of his assistant coaches. The news came out late last week. Quarterbacks coach Charles London, passing game coordinator Scott Turner, defensive line coach Eric Washington, and linebackers coach Aaron Curry, along with a couple of other defensive assistants. So 6 coaches are out. We can add Steve Wilks to that to make it 7, because Steve Wilks was fired after the Week 16 loss to the Jacksonville Jaguars. And there have been reports by multiple reporters that Tanner Engstrand, the offensive coordinator, is likely to be stripped of his play calling duties, and the Jets may get an outside coach to come in and take over play calling. So really, 8 coaches could be on the outs for the Jets. And that includes both coordinators, and it includes a lot of key position coaches. You know, your quarterbacks coach, Charles London, your passing game coordinator, Scott Turner, I guess not technically a position coach, but still a very important part of the offensive coaching staff. Your defensive line coach, Eric Washington. I mean, these are cornerstone position coaches on a football team. And I think this all proves that the Jets really just should have moved on from Aaron Glenn after the season, because if this entire coaching staff needs to be changed, why would you keep the head guy? You know, if this entire coaching staff was not up to the task, well, the guy who's the most important coach, the guy who's the most important part of that team was Aaron Glenn. And I understand that there is a kind of a rush to defend Glenn. The logic is, well, he realized he made mistakes, and it's better to move on from those mistakes and admit that you made a mistake and try and fix it than to carry on. And that's logical. And it's natural to change some parts of your staff after 1 year. I mean, I think any first-time head coach is not going to bat 1,000 hiring assistant coaches. But to miss on this many coaches, where you're replacing both coordinators and you're replacing key position coaches, you know, at some point you have to wonder, if Glenn was this bad at filling out his initial staff, why should we have confidence in him going forward? I equate it to what you hear about a struggling general manager sometimes. General manager misses on a lot of draft picks, cuts them early. People say, well, it's better to admit your mistake and move on than to pretend that this prospect was good. And that's all well and good. And yes, I'd rather have a GM who identifies a mistake early and moves on from it, rather than being stubborn and sticking with a player just because he drafted him. You know, you don't want to get into the sunk cost fallacy, that because you invested so much in a player or a coach that you have to stick with them even when it's clearly not working. That's not beneficial for anybody. But, you know, if your GM is missing on pick after pick after pick, moving on from those picks early really isn't that helpful to your team. And again, I'm not expecting Aaron Glenn to get everything right with his staff hires. That was never realistic. But when you get this much wrong, why am I to believe now in year 2 you're going to turn around and get every single thing right? A saying that I have is that if you need to replace one coordinator, you need a new coordinator. If you need to replace both coordinators, you need a new head coach. And I think if you've watched this defensive coordinator search, we're going to talk about that in more detail in a bit. The list of candidates has not been overwhelming. You know, it's been a list of candidates that is light on experience, or in one particular case, the guy that might be the favorite, you know, maybe the game has passed him by. This is not a list of the great defensive minds in football. And I think back to the end of the season, and the biggest defense I heard of Aaron Glenn, why he should not be fired, and this is a defense that I used at points during the regular season before the Jets fell apart the last 5 weeks, is that if you move on from Aaron Glenn, it's going to be very difficult to find a quality candidate to fill the head coaching job. And it was a fair point. Moving on from Aaron Glenn after one season would have been catastrophic for this franchise because this team's reputation, and deservedly so, is very, very low in the NFL community. This is a team that has had 15 straight years missing the playoffs. It's a team that has had 10 straight losing seasons. It has an owner who is not well respected in the NFL, and nor should he be. He is frankly an embarrassment. He's inept. He takes responsibility for nothing. He throws people under the bus. He's just the worst owner you could imagine. It would not have been easy to fill the job if Aaron Glenn had been fired. But what we're seeing here is it's not exactly easy for Aaron Glenn to fill out a coaching staff right now because the perception is he's in trouble. The perception is that he may not last for much longer. I mean, look at the candidates they've had on the defensive coordinator search. And it's going to be very difficult for Aaron Glenn to fill out the staff with the coaches that he's going to need to turn it around. So it's one thing to sit there and say, well, if you replace the head coach, who are you going to get to replace him? The challenge is if you keep the head coach, who's the staff that's going to lift him up? Who are the guys you're going to get who are going to help Glenn build this franchise up? Another point that I have to make is the pace with which the Jets made these changes is not inspiring confidence. I don't understand why it took 3 weeks to decide to get rid of all these position coaches. On a human level, it's not great for them because if the Jets were going to move on from these guys, they could have, the Jets could have made the move quickly after the season, given these guys a chance to find new jobs. But it just looks like they're indecisive right now. And, we're going to talk a little bit about Tanner Engstrand because there are all these reports out now that he's on the verge of being demoted. And, I think that that's the right move. I think that there are lots of areas where Engstrand's play calling was not very good this past season. But it's another thing where the Jets are just kind of dragging their feet on it. And this is not going to be, again, it's not going to be an easy sell to bring in quality offensive minds because you don't have a lot of talent on offense. You don't have a quarterback. And probably most importantly, it's not clear that Aaron Glenn has a lot of time left. I think that there's a big perception in the NFL right now that Aaron Glenn's on the hot seat, or if he's not on the hot seat, he's going to be quickly because this team is not set up to do good things in 2026. And even if Aaron Glenn doesn't begin the season on the hot seat per se, another bad season and you're in some real trouble. So, sometimes in life you're presented with one good choice and one bad choice. But that's not always the case. I think at the end of the season, the Jets were presented with two bad choices. One was to get rid of Aaron Glenn. And make no mistake about it, all of the negative consequences that people warned about if you fire Aaron Glenn after one season, they were all real. I'm not here to discount them. The problem is that keeping Aaron Glenn, it doesn't lead you to a better place because now you have a coach who clearly has admitted that he did not make the right hires on pretty much every key position last year. This is different. This is a different story if we're talking about Steve Wilkes and maybe one position coach. We're talking about both coordinators, your passing game coordinator and your quarterback's coach and your defensive line coach. So we're talking about your coordinators, your number one deputy coordinator, and two of your most important position coaches that you got wrong. I don't expect a coach to bat 1,000. I expect a coach to do better than that, though. If your coach can't do better than that, then you have to really question his ability to hire a staff. And by the way, hiring a staff is actually one of the most important parts of being a head coach. It's one of the clearest ways that a coach either sets his team up for success or sets them up for failure. And Aaron Glenn clearly, I think in his first year, set the Jets up for failure. Would it be better if he kept all these other coaches around? No. But we're not in a great situation. And the Jets were not in a great situation at the end of the year. They could have fired a coach after 1 year, and that would have led to a certain degree of chaos. But, if you're going to make the point that, hey, Aaron Glenn was better off admitting a mistake and moving on than he was sticking with coaches that weren't working, you can apply that at a macro level too. You can zoom out and say, maybe the Jets would have been better moving on from a head coach who doesn't work rather than sticking with something that isn't working. Unfortunately, that's where we are right now with this franchise. And as you're on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll move forward and we'll look forward because there could be a major shakeup on the offensive side of the ball. There are multiple reports that suggest the Jets are targeting a new outside hire to take over play calling for Tanner Engstrand. It's a It's a move that needs to be made, yet the Jets are doing it in a baffling way. And we'll discuss as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Prize Picks. The big game is almost here, and there's no better way to stay locked into every moment than with Prize Picks, the daily fantasy app where it always feels good to be right. With football season coming down to its final stretch, now is the perfect time to close it out strong. Prize Picks makes watching the game even more exciting by letting you build simple lineups around player projections. No drafts, no waiting, just football action all the way through the playoffs. Prize Picks is incredibly easy to get started. Pick 2 or more players and just choose more or less on their projections. It's a great way to keep playing fantasy football even after the season-long leagues are finished. And the favorite feature is early payouts, which lets you cash out if a player gets off to a hot start. Download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 in lineups after your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. It's good to be right. What if sports were traded like markets? Now you can put your sports IQ to work in real time with Robinhood prediction markets. It's not you against the house, it's you participating in a live market. You can buy or sell your positions live all game long. Use your sports knowledge in the moments that matter. Robinhood prediction markets changes the game. It's people moving the action, so when momentum shifts, you can move with it. I always knew the game, but never had a dynamic way to apply that knowledge. Now I can actually take part live in a market powered by people. You're no longer just a spectator. Play by play, you decide. Trade every play with Robinhood. Now available across the U.S. Download the Robinhood app now to begin. Futures and cleared swaps trading involves significant risk and is not appropriate for everyone. Event contracts are offered by Robinhood Derivatives, LLC, a registered futures commission merchant and swap firm. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day, and for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. If you have not already, go check out our new Everydayer Club. It includes access to an ad-free audio feed for Locked On Jets compatible with Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and every other major podcast app, along with an invite to the members-only Locked On Everydayer Club Discord server. Go to LockedOnNYJets.supercast.com or tap the link in the show notes to learn more. And today on Locked On Jets, we are talking about a major coaching shakeup for the New York Jets. 6 firings were announced late last week. A 7th firing, Steve Wilks, happened during the season. And there could be also a demotion for the most important coach on the offensive side of the ball, Tanner Engstrand. By the way, Aaron Wilson, who is an NFL insider based in Houston, was the one who reported the coach firings first. He also was the one who indicated that Tanner Engstrand's job responsibilities could be changing. And multiple local beat writers have since confirmed that the Jets are very likely to demote Engstrand and take away his play calling duties. Now, he may keep the title of offensive coordinator, but it does sound like there's a good possibility, although it's been made clear by every reporter so far that no final decisions have been made. But there's a very good possibility the Jets will bring in an outside hire to take over play calling duties for Tanner Engstrand. And, I think one subtle hint of this is Scott Turner, who was the passing game coordinator, was let go. And Turner was kind of a guy who was like a senior level offensive guy. Sometimes a team likes to hire an offensive coach with a lot of experience, and sometimes they'll call him like a senior offensive assistant. Sometimes they'll call him a senior offensive consultant. Sometimes they give him the pass game coordinator title. But I would expect that the replacement for Scott Turner would be the guy who would be a more experienced play caller, and he may take over the play calling for Tanner Engstrand. I have multiple thoughts on this. Number one, why can the Jets never just make a move directly? This always happens with the Jets, where instead of like just firing somebody who isn't doing the job, they decide to stick with them and they kind of try and figure out some workaround. It's not like the Jets are incapable of firing people. They just fired 6 of their assistant coaches. They fired their defensive coordinator in season. But for whatever reason, we get to a point where the Jets won't fire Tanner Engstrand. It's very puzzling to me. This is something that happens a lot around the Jets franchise. You may remember 2 years ago, after a miserable offensive 2023 season with Nathaniel Hackett, there were all these reports that the Jets wanted to essentially hire an offensive coach to do the exact same thing they're doing with Engstrand right now. They reportedly reached out to Arthur Smith, the former Steelers offensive coordinator who took the job with Pittsburgh that offseason instead. They essentially wanted Smith to take over the offensive coordinator responsibilities while Hackett retained the offensive coordinator title. And Smith eventually turned them down because he didn't really understand what they were asking him to do. And he saw what a bad situation he'd be walking into. If you're going to fire Engstrand, just fire Engstrand. There's no reason to keep him around. Is this merited? I think the answer to that is yes. I don't understand why Tanner Engstrand gets such a pass for the way the Jets played on offense this last year. He was in charge of it. I don't think I've ever seen something like this in the Jets fan base. Normally the offensive coordinator is the guy who bears all the burden for the struggles. It happened with Mike LaFleur, even though, Zach Wilson really wasn't a very good quarterback. It happened with Nathaniel Hackett, although that one was pretty just, in my opinion. It happened, you want to go back to Chan Gailey. Chan Gailey got blamed when things didn't go well. Of course, Adam Gase did. Again, that one was pretty just. Gase was the head coach, and he was also the primary play caller. It happened with Jeremy Bates's, Sam Darnold's rookie season. And we can go back to Brian Schottenheimer and the Mark Sanchez days. The coordinator always gets blamed when the Jets offense doesn't perform. But Engstrand just has gotten let off the hook by a lot of fans. And I guess it's because Justin Fields wasn't that good. Unlike a lot of the other quarterbacks, Justin Fields had kind of a track record of failure in the NFL. I think people weren't expecting the offense to be very good with Fields. But I think if you look at the offense Engstrand ran, it really did not make a lot of sense. Fields may not have been a good quarterback with Pittsburgh or with Chicago, but he was better with those two teams than he was with the Jets. Other than his rookie year, Fields' play with the Jets was worse than anything he'd done in the past. And that regression, I think, at least has to, in some part, be placed on Engstrand. Now, part of it was that, the group of pass catchers really wasn't very good either. The Jets did not have NFL caliber pass catchers for Fields this year. But, I looked at the offense Engstrand built, and it was nothing like the one I was expecting. I don't think it would have worked with Justin Fields anyway, but if Justin Fields had any chance, you had to take him out of a conventional NFL-style offense. You had to get to the quarterback run game. Lots of designed runs for Fields. You had to work the run-pass option game. You had to utilize Breece Hall in the screen game. And the Jets essentially ran a conventional offense. And as Fields struggled, you started to hear whispers in the media, well, he's not the right quarterback to run the offense. Whose fault is that? You guys were the ones that brought Justin Fields in. It's not like you inherited Justin Fields. You guys actively went out and signed Justin Fields in free agency. But even if you eliminate the quarterbacks from the equation, there's just a lot of stuff that makes no sense on a week-to-week basis. Like after Jets traded for John Mechie before week 10. Mechie had more screens thrown to him from week 10 on than Isaiah Williams did. I mean, explain that one to me. Isaiah Williams is a dynamic playmaker. When you throw a screen to a wide receiver, you're setting up a situation on offense that kind of simulates a return game. Isaiah Williams took multiple returns for touchdowns this year. Instead, you're throwing more screens to John Mechie, who's not really an explosive player. In fact, the Jets only threw one more screen to Breece Hall than they did to Mechie over those final 9 weeks of the season. You're just talking about a guy who doesn't use his players well. I mean, let's talk about how Breece Hall never had the ball thrown to him. I remember when Nathaniel Hackett was here at the end of his first season, he got absolutely roasted by the fan base because he made a comment. I never knew how useful Breece Hall was in the passing game. And people kind of mocked him. How do you not know how good Breece Hall was in the passing game? In context, he was praising Breece. He said he was more or less saying when I was with Green Bay or Denver, I didn't appreciate what a good receiver Breece was out of the backfield. That was all he was saying. Jets used Breece in the passing game a lot in 2023, though. It was one of the few things that Hackett got right. This year, Engstrand barely used Breece in the passing game. And, Hackett got annihilated for that one comment, whereas Engstrand actually doesn't use Breece in the passing game and gets a free pass. And, I could go through like a million situational play calls through the year. I mean, the one that really sticks out in my mind is when he tried to run a double move on Rasul Douglas on a 3rd and long when the Jets played the Miami Dolphins at MetLife Stadium. It was an interception by Brady Cook. It was a terrible throw. The ball Cook never should have thrown. But Douglas didn't bite on the double move. You're not going to get a veteran quarterback to try and drive on a receiver 3 yards before the sticks on a 3rd down play. It's just the sort of thing that shows he doesn't understand who he's attacking. He doesn't build his offensive structure with a plan. So it's not clear who the Jets are going to go get. Connor Hughes of SNY has floated the name Frank Reich, who is a longtime coach in this league. You may remember him. He was briefly Carolina's head coach. He was the Indianapolis Colts head coach for a few years. Prior to that, he was the Eagles offensive coordinator, actually interviewed for the Jets head coaching job back in 2014 and played for the Jets. He was a longtime backup quarterback in the NFL, one of the best backup quarterbacks ever. And Reich played for the Jets during the Kotite years. I think Reich's probably the best coach you're going to be able to get. And look, it's not a very exciting hire. I mean, Reich spent 2025 as the interim head coach at Stanford University, led them to a 4-8 record. He was not in football in 2024. In 2023, he was one and done as the Panthers head coach, got fired before the end of the season, got fired as the Colts head coach in 2022. So Frank Reich's a guy who has not been in the NFL from the start of the season to the end of the season since 2021. That's the sort of coach you're looking at. He has had success in the past. Like there was a stretch where he was one of the better offensive minds in the league. The question is whether the game's passed him by. Now, you could build out an argument, well, things were going pretty well in Indianapolis until Andrew Luck retired. And even then, he had some good seasons with some of the other quarterbacks they had. They had a decent season with Phillip Rivers in 2020. They made the playoffs. The offense was actually pretty decent in 2021. Things didn't really fall apart until they were forced to draft Anthony Richardson in 2022 and then went to an unstable Carolina situation in 2023. I guess you could make that case. And I think the best the Jets are going to be able to do in a situation like this is find a coach who's at least got a good track record in the past, but has fallen on hard times and maybe doesn't have a lot of options because he's been in some bad situations. I'm not saying that I necessarily buy that that's the reason that's a reason for big optimism for Frank Reich, but that's the sort of coach the Jets are going to have to get here because, again, this situation the Jets have after retaining Aaron Glenn and after the season they had and with the roster they had, it's just going to lead to difficult. It's going to be a difficult job to fill. I mean, there's no other way around it. So I guess Reich or somebody of that sort would be, about as good as the Jets could do. I'm not saying it'd be very exciting, but I think that the Jets would be. I think it is a good move though for the Jets to move on from Tanner Engstrand because Engstrand may be a good coach one day, but I think he showed that he's not up to the job right now, particularly a job as big as the Jets have trying to rebuild this offense. Jets also have a defense to rebuild, though. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the Jets defensive coordinator search. There was major movement on that over the weekend. They had their first in-person interview to try and fill Steve Wilks' vacant defensive coordinator job. And the candidate they interviewed might be the favorite, but I'm not sure he's the right choice. We'll discuss continuing here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Indeed. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job posts seen on other sites. Indeed sponsored jobs put your post at the top of the page and helps you reach the right candidates faster. If I needed to hire someone for this show, I'd go straight to Indeed and be very specific about what I need. Real experience, not just a resume buzzword. Instead of struggling to get your job post seen, Indeed sponsored jobs helps your listing stand out and reach quality candidates faster. Sponsored jobs boost your post to the people who are the best match for your role, and that makes a real difference. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed are 90% more likely to report a hire than non-sponsored jobs. Spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results using Indeed sponsored jobs. Listeners of this show get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. Just go to Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Do it the right way with Indeed. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We are talking about some major coaching shakeups for the New York Jets. The team has been on a defensive coordinator search for a couple of weeks now. They fired Steve Wilks after week 15. Chris Harris took over as the interim defensive coordinator for the last 3 games of the season. And there really has not been much news on the defensive coordinator search. 2 weeks ago, at the end of the week, the Jets unveiled a list of 8 candidates. So the one thing you can say about the Jets is that they have been keeping things quiet. There have not been many leaks in the process. Well, over the weekend, the Jets did do their first in-person interview, or at least their first publicized in-person interview. It is with Wink Martindale, former defensive coordinator at the University of Michigan. Prior to that, he was the defensive coordinator for a couple of years with the Giants under Brian Dable, so knows New York well. Prior to that, he was the defensive coordinator of the Baltimore Ravens. Longtime assistant in the NFL, almost 2 decades on NFL coaching staffs, and track record, up and down. Some very good seasons, particularly in his Baltimore days. One decent season with the Giants, one season that wasn't so great. He's gone to Michigan, and depending on who you talk to, some people love him, some people don't. There's been a lot of speculation that Wink Martindale could be the favorite to land the Jets defensive coordinator job. A longtime coach in this league. I think he's a decent coach. I just am not sure he's the right fit for this job. I say that for a couple of reasons. When I look at the job he did at Michigan, I hear what Michigan fans have to say, and I don't think anybody outright thinks he's a horrible coach, but lots of the complaints are that, he's too stubborn. He's stuck in his specific system, that, it's too easy for modern offenses to exploit what his scheme is on defense. It sounds like a lot of the complaints we had with Steve Wilks. Now, I do think Wink Martindale's a better coach than Steve Wilks. I think Wink Martindale would have this defense playing at a more professional level than Steve Wilks. I think the Jets would have an interception or two if Wink Martindale was their defensive coordinator. I think that's a given no matter who the defensive coordinator will be. But I worry that we are running into a situation that's too similar to what we had with Wilks, and that I don't think Wilkes and Glenn complemented each other well. I think Glenn has very old school sensibilities, and in the right doses, that's not a bad thing. But I think one of the most important things for a head coach to do is hire a staff that fills in the gaps for your weaknesses. There are certain things every coach brings to the table. There's certain things coaches don't bring to the table. And it's different for every coach. Sean McVay brings a lot of offensive knowledge to the table. He does not bring a lot of defensive knowledge to the table. So he's got to make sure he hires a great defensive coaching staff. Some coaches are very well versed in the passing game, but not so much in the run game. So they need to hire a coach who understands run concepts. You essentially need to know what you're good at and hire coaches who can fill in the gaps for the things you aren't good at. And this manifests itself in many ways. One of them is, Glenn is very old school. You listen to the way he talks, the way he approaches things. He used the phrase a lot on the offensive side of the ball in training camp and in the offseason. When it comes to wide receivers, no block, no rock. What that meant is that wide receivers need to be able to block if they want to see the ball. That's really old school. I'm not sure that that's the best thing for an offense in the modern NFL. I'm not sure that a run-first approach is the best thing for a modern offense in the NFL. And on the defensive side of the ball, I don't think there's anything wrong with blitzing if you have the right personnel for it, if your blitzes are well designed. In the modern NFL, you see lots of what's known as mugging the A gaps. You walk your linebackers down to the line of scrimmage. You have 4 defensive linemen, walk your linebackers down, 2 linebackers standing between the center and the guard on either side. And you send the blitz there to get quick to the quarterback. Modern NFL offenses are built on getting the ball out quickly. And I think there were too many times with Steve Wilkes where the Jets blitzes just took too long to get home and they were too predictable. One of the things because the NFL has become such a league of precision passing, of getting the ball out quickly, your blitzes have to get home early. You don't have 3 seconds the way you used to. You have to be able to get home. And I think that lots of Wink Martindale schemes maybe are a little outdated. And I worry about a defense that relies heavy on man coverage in today's NFL because it's really hard to play man-to-man defense unless you have an elite corner. I think it's one thing for Aaron Glenn to come in here and say we're going to run a lot of man when Sauce Gardner's your number 1 corner. Sauce Gardner is one of the few corners who can handle that sort of role. When you trade Sauce Gardner, there are reasons for it, but what you're doing is you're really limiting your defense's ability to play man-to-man. And one of the things that's been true of Wink Martindale over the course of his career is that, he's stuck with man-to-man a lot. I mean, I'm not saying that he's never shown any ability to adapt. I'm not saying he's never shown any ability to show modern principles, but I see a lot of the same old school stuff that Glenn has. And I think if you combine a guy with old school tendencies and someone with more modern sensibilities, you get the best of both worlds. You can get the right balance. And that's one of the reasons I'm a big fan of the Jets potentially bringing in Jim Leonard, who's the Broncos passing game coordinator on the defensive side of the ball. I love Jim Leonard as a player. I also loved Aaron Glenn as a player. So that doesn't, how a guy performs as a player with the Jets isn't really relevant to the sort of coach that they are. I'm not convinced that Leonard is going to be able to fix this team. I think the job's really big. I think that it might be too big for someone like Leonard. But of the candidates the Jets have interviewed, of the plausible candidates for this job, he's the one who fits the profile that I think the Jets need. And that Leonard brings a lot of more modern defensive concepts to the table. He's a guy who's got experience as a defensive coordinator. Even if it was at college, it was a major college at the University of Wisconsin. He's really the only candidate who checks both of those boxes for me. The other candidates the Jets are interviewing, very thin on coordinator experience. And I think that for a job this big, you have to either have experience on the NFL level or a major college, have running a defense before. And the only other, Martindale's really the only coordinator other than Leonard who has experience. And it's great that he's got experience, but I don't think he brings a lot of modern ideas to the table. And I think that's going to be critical for whatever defensive coordinator the Jets hire. So I think this is partially a commentary on how difficult this job is to fill right now, as we've discussed. I mean, I think that if you're an assistant coach, the Jets are probably not the team you're looking at. And there are other factors with Leonard. Anybody who's followed Jim Leonard's career knows that his dream job is the head coaching job at the University of Wisconsin. He started his coaching career at Wisconsin. It's where he played, worked his way up from a low-level coach to the defensive coordinator, eventually became the interim head coach in 2022. He really wanted the head job. They ended up going with Luke Fickell, which at the time was a logical move. Luke Fickell at the time was one of the best coaches in college football, one of the most accomplished coaches in college football. It was a bitter disappointment for Leonard, though, when he left Wisconsin. It hasn't worked out well with Fickell. Fickell barely survived this season. Fickell is entering 2026 very much on the hot seat. that job could become available, and Leonard will want it. If you're Jim Leonard right now, and you know that maybe if everything lines up, if Wisconsin has a bad year, your dream job becomes available, and they passed on you last time, and maybe are regretting passing on you because of how things have gone with Luke Fickell, that you have a good shot at getting that job. You guys still have a lot of people who support you at the school. Are you going to want to risk going to the Jets situation that's this unsettled? I think Leonard's going to go for the position, the job that's most likely to lead him to look good. There's a good chance if you take this Jets job, you're not going to look good. And this is true across, the coaching landscape, is that this is just a really tough job to fill. It's a tough situation because it can work out for you, but there's a lot of risk joining the Jets right now in a way that there wasn't a year ago. With a first-year coaching staff, you typically come in with some degree of security, unless you have like the sort of year Aaron Glenn just had. You're probably going to get multiple years to turn it around. There's always, again, like if you have a 3-14 season the way the Jets just had, all bets are off. But if you jump on to a team like Aaron Glenn has right now, off that 3-14 season, you're really taking a big risk. And I think that's true. I think that's why the Jets have struggled to find quality candidates on the defensive side of the ball. And it's why Wink Martindale might be the favorite right now, because Wink Martindale doesn't have a lot of choices if he wants to return to the NFL. Jim Leonard does. And that's a tough spot for the Jets. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Monday, everybody. Try and stay warm as you shovel out if you're in the New York area. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.